Hi everybody, thanks very much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn. I run the services at MedComms and the associated websites. So information, resources, activities, and so on for people who work in and around the global MedComms community, by which I mean people who work in and around medical communications, medical education, medical publishing, and the associated businesses. So you'll find lots going on at medcommsnetworking.com. If you haven't been, go and have a look and look at some of the associated sites like NetworkPharma TV, where you'll find hundreds now of recordings of videos like this, of webinars like this and others. If you're interested in the MedComms business, we do a lot at first, medcommsjob.com, and there's others as well. So go and have a look around. And hopefully you'll find lots of useful information. Today, absolutely delighted to have the guys from AMICULUM, and we're going to basically be talking, or they're going to talk about rare diseases and cell and gene therapy disease. So specialist areas within the healthcare communications, which should lead into some interesting discussion about those areas. I'm not going to say much more other than ask them to kick off. And Steve, you're going to kick us off, aren't you? So over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Peter. You should be seeing the slides now. Yep. Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. So my name is Steve North, and I'm scientific lead for Seques, which is an AMICULUM agency. And this afternoon, together with my colleagues, we're going to discuss our approaches and experiences with specialist healthcare communications in the fields of gene and cell therapies and rare diseases. So briefly introduce ourselves, AMICULUM is an independent healthcare communications and consultancy business. It's been around for more than 20 years now. And employs over 340 people across 9 countries in 11 specialist agencies. These are identified along the bottom here. I'm sure you recognise and have heard of some of them before. So among these agencies are Comradis, which is our team specialising in the field of rare diseases, and Seques, an agency that specialises in genetically informed healthcare, particularly gene and cell therapies. These areas are fast growing in the pharmaceutical and biotech markets and present unique challenges, often requiring a unique and specialised response. So today, along with my colleagues Rachael and Maggie from Comradis and Isabelle from Seques, we're going to give you some more details on the focus of these agencies. We're going to provide some insights on the kinds of challenges and considerations we need to account for when working in these fields, and present some examples of our work before opening the floor, hopefully, for an interesting Q&A discussion. So I'm just going to hand over to Rachael, who's going to tell us a bit more about Comradis.
Thanks, Steve. So Comradis is AMICULUM's rare disease agency. As you can see on this slide, 1 in 17 people suffer from a rare disease at some point in their life. Those eagle-eyed people on the call will notice that there's actually 16 dots in the logo. So I suppose you could look at this in one of 2 different ways. Either the numbers changed since we developed the logo, or our design team took some creative license when developing it. But I'll leave that to you guys. Currently at Comradis, we've got 18 team members, and within the team, we've got a wealth of experience supporting medical communications for rare diseases and uncommon cancers. So to date, we've supported over 50 indications, meaning that we've got a good understanding and base knowledge of how to approach these conditions that often require very specialist and targeted approaches to small groups of healthcare professionals and patients. And then going into our key service platforms, so the first one being communications. So we cover the full spectrum of medical communications, whether that be from market access, marketing, medical education, etc. But I suppose the main difference with the general medical communications agency is that we need to take a more targeted approach based on the needs of people with rare diseases, which often differ. The next one is commercialization. So we work with our clients at every stage of the product lifecycle. So from the early clinical development through to product launch. And some of our clients we've partnered with from the very early stages of their product's development, which means that we know how to strategically guide them through a rare disease product lifecycle. And I suppose one of the main aims is bringing novel treatments to patients sooner. And then in terms of communities, I suppose patients with rare diseases often have different needs to those with more common conditions. Patients can feel very isolated because there's not really necessarily always a community of other people suffering from the same disease as them out there. And I suppose they can often feel unseen and unheard. So we try to put the patient voice at the forefront of everything that we do, whether that be through communications at congresses or partnering with patient organisations and charities. Yeah, so I'll hand back to Steve to give an overview of what Seques do.
Thanks very much. So in 2018, AMICULUM recognised that advances in understanding the genetic basis of disease was leading to major developments in the management of a range of disorders, both common and rare. And as such, founded Seques to serve the communications and consultancy needs of this field specifically. So Seques has provided medical education and clinical trial support, amongst others, to many cell and gene therapies so far, which include CRISPR-Cas9 based gene editing, recombinant adenovirus vectors, and CAR-T, to name a few. There's some more presented on the slide down there. Whilst most of our work is on gene and cell therapies, our remit is quite wide, and it stretches from therapies for inherited genetic diseases to mRNA vaccines. And while we have team members with relevant academic backgrounds, such as degrees or PhDs, postdocs in genomics or genetics or other fields that are relevant, our team members with valuable healthcare communications experience are equally important to supporting the proposition. And we make a point of marrying those two together to kind of support that proposition.
Thanks, me. So what we're going to talk about today through this presentation and a few of the case studies that we're going to share is how MedComms for rare diseases and cell and gene therapies differs with those for more common diseases. And we're going to talk about some of the considerations and key challenges that we face. I think what you'll see is that there's a lot of areas of overlap between what Comradis and Seques do, and this opens us up to lots of opportunities for knowledge sharing and collaboration between the two agencies, which is really nice. So just moving on to the next slide. So in terms of the considerations and challenges in rare diseases, I think starting with the types of companies that we work with, as well as a lot of the big pharma companies that everybody works with in MedComms, we also work with a lot of smaller, more specialised biotech companies. And the key difference with these companies is that they may only have one or two products in their pipeline. The teams are much smaller, and team members can wear lots of different hats and take on lots of different responsibilities. Budgets can also often be much smaller as well, meaning that we just need to be like more lean and targeted with the solutions that we offer. But I think the nice thing is that we can, in a lot of cases, become an extension of their team, meaning that we get good insight into what else they're doing internally, and we can offer more strategic support and add value to their activities. As mentioned earlier, the patient perspective is key in everything that we do. There's often a lack of specialists or like specialists might not necessarily exist in the areas in which patients live, making them not as accessible as one would like. And also as well, there can be lack of guidelines, etc. So it can all come together to mean that patients basically undergo a long journey to diagnosis, which can be quite distressing for them. And this means that patients can become really educated about the disease and therapy area and become ambassadors for their own care. They can set up patient organisations and support groups, and you've probably seen in the news like people lobbying for change where they've not been able to get access to the treatments that they need, etc. So as I said earlier, we try to keep the patient perspective in mind in everything that we do. Moving on to medical education, as already mentioned, there can be a small group of true experts in the field. There might be multiple specialities involved in patient care, so finding the right communication channels can often be quite complex. And with the work that we do in medical education, the focus can be quite different as well. Often there are either one or no competitors, so the focus of our communications can be more around raising awareness of the disease and increasing diagnosis, etc. Because HCPs are just generally happy that there's even an option for their patients where there's not been one before. So that's a big difference. And then to cover market access. In rare diseases, drugs can be very expensive, and I think this is down to the investment into developing the drugs based on the number of patients that they're able to treat. And despite legislation and things like the Orphan Drug Act being brought into place, patients still often don't get access to the treatments that they need. Patients can be put on clinical trials for drugs and find that one's working for them better than anything else that they've been given before, and then a drug might not meet its primary endpoint in a trial and it can be pulled from the patient, which can be devastating. So yeah, we work with our clients on and support them with the market access. I guess clients just generally need to show a better value proposition for the drugs, showcase strong data, and patient reported outcomes is key as well. In terms of our communications, I think, as I mentioned earlier, budgets can be quite restricted. So we just need to make everything that we do quite lean and meaningful and make sure that we're targeting it at the right audience and the right people. So I guess this is where it's quite nice, where we become an extension of our clients' internal team, because we get to know what their goals are and really tap into those and work out the best solutions for our clients. Yeah, and then finally, evidence base. The evidence base is often much smaller. There's a lot more work to be done in terms of interpreting and translating data that's out there. So we often get involved in, as well, like mapping projects and things like that, to support them and get them the information that they need. And based on that, I'll hand back over to Steve, who will talk about key considerations from a Seques perspective, but you'll see a lot of overlap.
Yeah, thanks, Rach. So what we've tried to demonstrate here is that there is overlap in the challenges and considerations between cell and gene therapies and rare diseases. One important one to note being that many of the novel gene and cell therapy approaches are started in rare diseases. So we tend to find that a lot of the rare disease options and drugs in development are gene therapies at least. And with that, these are also novel approaches, novel science, and these technologies and approaches are new to our clients. Sometimes they may have come from big pharma, the more traditional drug approach. They're new to HCPs, particularly in the more common fields. more common disease fields, and obviously new to patients as well. Just to touch on one other similarity around the patient perspectives point, in the cell and gene therapy space, we've tended to find it's communicating with patients involved in trials. The trial designs are can be substantially different to your classic clinical trial in cell and gene therapy, partly because sometimes you're looking at what is hoped to be a one-time treatment. So the follow-up can be many years, like decades or 15 years, to ensure the outcome is met and that the safety outcomes are met. So in those cases, the patient engagement needs to be maintained for that amount of time, which is a challenge we certainly have to deal with. In cell and gene therapies, we're considering quite complex science, and we find that our clients place a lot of high value in us understanding that as well, particularly the molecular mechanisms and the mechanism of the therapy. And this leads on to us being involved at the early stages. So we find ourselves perhaps more involved in the early life cycle of a therapy than perhaps we would do with a more traditional medication. So in some cases, we supported the preclinical and early phase communications, foundational strategy and scientific story at that stage, and the specifics of manufacturing of these treatments are a lot more important. And finally, we've also had experience working with collaborations that tend to occur. There are a lot of small biotechs that start up in this field, and with a particular approach, and they partner with perhaps a big pharma company for support and funding. And in those cases, that presents a number of opportunities and challenges, particularly because there are multiple stakeholders, different processes. Some are experienced with drug development, some are new to it. So some with different agendas, and this obviously provides a lot of different things for us to manage compared with working with a single company. So moving on from there, we thought it would be nice to share some specialist medical communications in practice. So I'm going to hand over to Maggie, who's going to share a case study on educating a lay audience about a novel gene therapy for a rare disease.
Thanks very much, Steve. So our role, as we all know, in medical comms is to facilitate effective communications. And as Rachael alluded to, we ultimately want to help improve patients' lives. So Isabelle, over the next 10 minutes or so, Isabelle and I will share some case studies to show how we can educate lay audiences about gene therapies for rare diseases and how we prepare gene therapy clinical trial materials for multiple audiences. But before that, I'd just like to take a few minutes to consider the challenges posed by rare diseases and gene therapies from a patient perspective. So trying to put ourselves in patients' shoes and to try and understand what they're going through, particularly around the time of diagnosis. So as Rachael alluded to, one of the biggest challenges in rare diseases is the scarcity of resources. So patients often can't get hold of the accurate, reliable information that they need because it's simply not available. And coupled with this, there's a lack of disease awareness, not only amongst the general public, but also amongst healthcare professionals. So a patient may show signs of a disease, but they may struggle to find doctors who are knowledgeable enough to diagnose and manage them. But where there is expertise, that pool of experts may be very small, and patients may have to travel significant distances or even to different countries for their hospital appointments and to get treatment. And that just adds to the overall burden of living with a rare disease. It's also likely, as Rachel said, that there's no clear referral or care pathways. So patients are often shunted from one specialist to another with little or no care, no coordination in their care. And as we've heard, there are very few treatments that are available. So these all have a tremendous impact on patients and their families. Many patients experience delays in their diagnosis. They're often misdiagnosed and therefore put on inappropriate treatments that can be harmful. And around 20% of those with a rare disease actually remain undiagnosed throughout their lives. But even if you do get a diagnosis, the average time it takes is about 5 to 7 years. And in that time, patients often have to see multiple different specialists before they get that diagnosis. So patients therefore can't get the treatment and care that they need. And by the time that they do so, their disease may well have progressed to a point where the treatment is no longer beneficial. And consequently, they have much poorer outcomes. We also know that many people affected by rare diseases struggle to find the accurate and information that they need. So research that was carried out by Rare Disease UK a few years ago found that patients and their families were often given very little information about their disease at the time of diagnosis. And 30% of these people actually reported that they didn't understand all of the information that they were given. So this leaves people having to do their own research. And as you're aware, some of the things on the internet are simply not trustworthy, can be quite scary, and in some cases even harmful. So that means that there's a real need for educational materials that are not only accurate and reliable, but also accessible and easy to understand. And having this type of information and knowledge really means that patients and their families are empowered to have those conversations with their healthcare professionals, ask the right questions, and make informed decisions about their treatment and care. And as Steve has alluded to, one area where there's a particular need for patient and public education is in cell and gene therapy. And that's where we as specialist agencies can come in. So Steve, if you can just move on to the next slide, please. So just want to talk through one of the case studies with you. One of our clients is developing a specific form of gene therapy to treat certain rare metabolic diseases. And they asked if we could help them develop a series of newsletter type articles that could be used to inform and educate patients and also the public about this type of gene therapy and how it could be used to treat particular diseases. So we work closely with the with the client's patient advocacy team to understand the needs of their patients. But our client felt that their target audience was actually generally well educated. So they didn't want to have content to be too simplistic, and they didn't want us to shy away from using scientific terminology. So after a little bit of discussion with our clients, we eventually developed a style that struck a balance that catered for those who know about their disease and those who are newly diagnosed and perhaps have less knowledge. And we use the proper scientific terms throughout, but we made sure that it was backed up by a glossary. And we also use diagrams wherever possible to help explain things more clearly, as you can see in the inserts on the right-hand side. We decided to segment the information into different themes, and we eventually developed a 3-part series. So the first article provided a general overview to help patients understand gene therapy in the context of their disease and explain how it differs from conventional treatment. And then the second article provided a more practical guide to gene therapy to help patients and their families understand the overall process, the different steps involved, and the practicalities that they need to consider to give patients an idea of what to expect if they were to go on gene therapy. So a lot of patients like to get a handle on how many hospital visits they would need, what tests they need to have, how long they've been in hospital for, whether they've been inpatient, outpatients. Those sorts of information are very often the types of things that they want to know about, but it's not always readily available. So we try to incorporate all of this information into this newsletter article to help inform our audience. And finally, for the third article, we interviewed a patient about their lived experience of gene therapy to try and provide a realistic insight into life before and after treatment. And then these 3 articles were disseminated to patient organizations, rare disease societies, and also was posted on our client's website. And we hope that they've helped to increase in any way to help people understand about gene therapy for rare diseases. Thank you. So I'll hand on to Isabelle now.
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. Yeah, so I'll just talk a little bit about one of the case studies that we've been working on at Seques, which has been preparing gene editing clinical trial materials for multiple audiences. So this was a CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing therapy for the treatment of hematological diseases. And in this account, we're working with two global companies who were collaborating together. And we were in the middle of this, which I'll talk about in a moment, about the challenges of that. What they asked us to do was to support with some parallel phase 1-2 clinical trials of this novel gene therapy for hematological diseases. For this end, they asked us to support with recruitment and educational materials for patients and HCPs. And we also developed all of the clinical trial branding trials. So this involved developing materials such as leaflets, posters, guidebooks, animations, and a website for the patients. So this was very much clinical trial education and to help them inform enrollment decisions and support them throughout their participation. And also information about referring the patients to hematologists for the trial to support recruitment and facilitate their ongoing connections with the investigators. And the materials that we developed for HCPs included things like annotated protocol synopses, patient ID tools, and animation for the CRISPR-Cas9 tool. So altogether, it's quite a wide array of materials developed. So it's a little snapshot of the kind of things that we developed to try and make them nice and visual, both of the HCPs and for the patients themselves. And so with such a particular different audiences, there were specific challenges that came up there. Well, actually, one of the fundamental challenges of this particular project was the coordination between two companies. And I think this will probably happen when we have novel therapies like gene therapy coming through. They're sometimes developed by smaller companies that get acquired by bigger companies. So there is sometimes this coordination, this working between two companies at the same time. So this required quite a lot of coordination and management, where we were sometimes the middle ground between two different systems, two different ways of working. So that was quite a practical challenge for working with these on this account. Another challenge was, this has been alluded to many times today, pitching the language, particularly for the patients. So I've mentioned scissors there. So this is one thing that came up, which was trying to develop a lexicon for how to talk to patients about gene therapies. And one idea that was pitched was to talk about the Cas9 as scissors that were cutting the DNA. And actually the feedback from that was scary, and people thought they were being cut with actual scissors, and it was there's kind of disconnect sometimes between how we might describe or make an analogy for how the science works versus how that's interpreted by an audience of different levels. So certainly there were challenges there, but we, like I said, we developed this lexicon to try and from the beginning create a baseline of how this should be talked about to the different audiences. Also, one thing that happened at around the same time as working on this account was the biophysicist in China who decided to gene edit human embryos. So this caused quite a furore, and it probably had an effect on the perception of for the public about gene editing. So we had to have a kind of sensitivity to the public's perception of what they thought of gene editing and make sure that that didn't have an impact on how they were receiving materials. So there was quite a lot to consider in terms of what we were putting out there. And then another thing for this was a novel treatment, a new clinical trial. So practical things like the clinical trial protocol was continuously being updated, which meant work was quite difficult to make sure that everything was always updated. So in the end, the solution to that was to create protocol agnostic materials so that they weren't required to be updated continuously. And then more recently, we've actually been working on a new clinical trial for the pediatric population. which has created its own challenges because it's now a new audience, a new level. So not only are we developing materials for the children, but also for the parents. So just to mention the parents, we have to consider the sensitivities of that they are reading these. They aren't patients. They need to, we need to make sure that we're gauging the level of information that we're giving so that when they read about something that's going to happen to their child, that's done in a sensitive way. And then for the children, for the trial, the age range is between 2 and 11. And in theory, you could probably develop 10 different materials, one for every age group, because the developmental range in that age group is vast. So there were some also like legal challenges about what you need to present to a 6-year-old in order to, for example, assent to a clinical trial. So this was a challenge to work with the company for them to understand from their side as well what was legally required. So certainly this particular age group has its own challenges. It's very rewarding in terms of what you can produce, but certainly there are very unique challenges for pitching gene therapy clinical trial materials to a parent and a young child population. So thanks. I'll pass back over to the team.
You're on mute, I think.
Sorry, everybody. So, given the overlap that we've seen between specialisms, I think we were just going to take a bit of time to talk through how AMICULUM's set up in a way that encourages collaborative working. So I guess it all comes from the qualities that we look for when recruiting team members. So I think the first one is agility and the ability to be adaptable and meet the changing needs of the environment and the rapid therapy area progress. The next one is passion and knowledge. So for rare diseases and cell and gene therapy. Courage. So I guess as you've seen throughout the presentations, we often need to do things quite differently and not follow what's been done before. And creativity, so like the ability to think on your feet and find new ways to meet objectives and reach different audiences.
And this is all kind of underpinned by the structures in place across AMICULUM as a whole. So there's a shared culture and values across the agencies, which I believe the Cogent team from AMICULUM recently discussed in another webinar, which is obviously supportive of teamwork and collaboration. There are common internal processes and infrastructure between agencies that make knowledge sharing and collaboration quite seamless. We have regular open lines of communication between teams, which allows expertise to be drafted in where needed to support on a specific project or program. And ultimately, this is collaboration and teamwork is nothing new between our teams. There's regular collaboration across AMICULUM, which lays the groundwork for more and more to go on. And there's no competition for business. Collaborations are based on bringing together the appropriate skills for our clients. And we kind of want to deliver for them in a collaborative way between our teams. So that's all from us. Thank you very much for listening. We've left our contact details there, but you can also find us on LinkedIn. I'm going to pass back to Peter, who's going to organise a Q&A.
Great, thank you very much, Steve. Thanks. If we can just lose those slides, but that's super. Just in the next few minutes, I'd just like to try and involve involve the audience a little bit as well with some questions and so on. So those of you that are watching us, do use those chat boxes to send us your comments, any observations, any questions, and we'll weave those in. Couple of can I just draw out from my point of view just a quick question, and I'm going to possibly get this wrong, so sorry, but I think Isabelle, I think you've very much worked within the area you're working in for the last couple of years. But Steve, Rachel, I'm not so sure about Maggie, you've got a much broader experience, I believe. I just wondered whether you can compare and contrast a little bit more individually, personally, how you found working in the sort of more I don't know, how do you describe it, non-rare disease type area, you know, the broader spectrum of medical disease and so on, versus the more targeted rare disease specialist type areas. Can you say a few words? I mean, do you find yourself drawing comparison? There are differences, you've drawn some of those out, but how do you find it personally? Steve, I'll go with you first. Sorry.
I think, I mean, so I don't have any heritage or background in genetics or cell and gene therapy. I've certainly learned a lot of that since joining Seques, which means that I'm mainly drawing on my healthcare communications experiences, which I think the principles of are pretty constant, but it's just applying them in a way that's relevant to the projects that we're being asked to do for cell and gene therapies. I think I could probably say that in previous experience with bigger brands and more traditional programs, there may be more kind of consistency in the kind of work that we do between those programs, whereas in the more niche space, I think we need to be more adaptable, more willing to think about something new, and kind of address needs in a slightly different way. We're kind of working with people who may have been in academia for most of their career and then set up a startup, and now they are discovering what opportunities are available, perhaps in the form of agencies, and then they have to work out how they want to work with those and what they want us to do, rather than a large company coming to us with a program or with a strategy and saying, right, we need you to do this, this, and this. It's a bit more kind of starting from scratch in a way. I don't know if Rach, you have anything.
So Rach, have you got any more comments on that sort of point?
No, I think Steve really summarised it quite well. I think the underlying principles are the same. I guess just going back to what I was saying earlier, the company setups are often quite different, and like the pharma companies that we work with are often much smaller. So we can be much more involved in helping them with their strategy and working out what they need to do. I mean, in some instances, the companies that we're with don't have approval process and things like that in place. So I think it differs quite a lot from that perspective as well.
But that in itself is interesting, because it's more about the practicalities and the sorts of people you work with, rather than the type of disease or the type of whatever. I mean, a couple of things struck me just listening to you all talking, and possibly the most important thing, and I might have slightly got the wrong impression here, but I mean, it's interesting talking to you guys or listening to you talk, because it is different from a lot of the ways in which a more so-called traditional MedComms agency would be talking. And I think that's just interesting, apart from anything else, because it's very difficult to define what MedComms is. I mean, it's quite a, there's quite a mixture of people working on different sorts. But so some of the stuff you talked about is a little bit different to what maybe people would expect from a MedComms agency. That's interesting. But what came through incredibly strongly as you were all talking was the importance of patients, not the importance of patients, that's the wrong way, they focus on patients. And the fact that an awful lot of the time you were talking about materials for patients, and that's a little bit different from a lot of the MedComms agencies, but I might have got that slightly wrong. So I just wondered whether, am I getting it wrong? Because most MedComms agencies would largely communicate with healthcare professionals, academics, whatever, and increasingly, yes, patients, but it's still a minority. It came through very strongly listening to you that you were talking to patients most of the time. Was I missing the point, Maggie? You were going to jump in there.
No, I was going to say that certainly in rare diseases, we've got a real clear line of sight of who we're targeting, and that's a specific patient group is who we're targeting in rare diseases. Whereas I've in all my medical writing career, I've always worked in rare diseases, so I don't know what it's like to work in more common diseases. But I can imagine that, for example, a drug for cardiovascular disease could target lots of different audiences, so it's slightly different. But with rare disease, we know who the audience is likely to be, and we have a very clear sight of that. So maybe that is the difference, working in this area.
Probably
it must. Sorry, go on, Steve.
No, I just wanted to add that I'd probably say it's not the case that we spend most of our time doing materials and assets for patients. I'd say patients are a bigger consideration in certainly for the cell and gene therapy line of work. and we have to remain cognizant of them quite a lot of the time. I think we certainly do a lot on the HCP side of things as well. And I think because of for the cell and gene therapy space, it's all new technology. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So there's probably like a kind of public perception piece to do as well, to make sure it's being explained clearly enough to patients that they understand what's happening to them. Like Isabelle said on the kind of scissors analogy for gene editing, that is very difficult to explain to someone without a scientific background. So that's kind of what we have to remain conscious of.
I do think, I think it's just it is interesting, and as I say, maybe I'm just comparing and contrasting a little bit. But one of the things actually I wanted to ask first on, I don't think you said it, so apologies if you did say it, but let's just be clear, or can we be clear? When we're talking rare diseases, what's the definition you use? There is a definition.
There are definitions, and they differ wherever you are around the world. So in Europe, it's less than 1 in 2,000 population.
Okay. I suppose what I'm getting at there is, one of the things I was aware of when I started becoming more aware of rare diseases is that there's lots of them, and you don't necessarily think of them as rare diseases.
Yeah. I mean,
it's not the unheard of, unusual disease. There's actually lots of
there's lots of diseases, but each one may be individually very rare.
Exactly.
So I mean, but as Rachel said, 1 in 17 people have a rare disease. So in the UK, that's equivalent to 3.5 million people, which is quite a lot. That's an awful lot of people. But
exactly.
And there are more common rare diseases that perhaps more people have heard of, like cystic fibrosis or multiple sclerosis. And then you can go down to the diseases where it literally only affects a handful of people throughout the world. So there's a very, very big spectrum.
Exactly. But so again, it's just worth articulating that a little bit. I mean, I remember when I was involved in CF, for instance, and it was interesting in all sorts of ways, actually. But one, and that was quite a long time ago. It was there was a very, very direct contact with the patient group, which brought a lot of challenges, frankly, in terms of me working in a pharma company and dealing directly with the patient group, sort of thing. But you go CF, well, that's not a rare disease. I mean, most people would go, that's a rare disease, but actually it's just a question of language and what you actually mean. So it's worth just explaining that a little bit. A question came in early on. Let's just cover off a couple of quick questions. Anonymous was asking, a question to the Seques team: have you worked on cell and gene therapies for more common diseases then?
Particularly in the oncology space, there's a range of cell and gene therapies being developed, primarily at the moment for blood cancers, with development phases and ongoing in solid tumours. So we haven't had an opportunity in solid tumours yet, but plenty of experience in blood cancers. I think we're going to see a lot more coming through in the kind of inflammatory disease area as well. And yeah, I think there's plenty of different opportunities, and CNS as well, to be fair. Isabelle, I think this might be more your field. I don't know if there's anything you want to add at all.
No, I mean, CNS, I did a bit of that for my PhD, and I know at the time that developing any kind of therapies for CNS was basically, good luck, see how you do. So that would be a massive breakthrough area, I think, going forward, if they were to. But certainly, as you say, oncology, I think that would be the most sort of common disease area that we've been working on in terms of gene therapy.
Okay. Just a couple of questions have come in about, I think, basically talking communications with children. Jane is saying, what sort of feedback do you get? Were they well enough to absorb the information? Were there misunderstandings and so on? I mean, that's a whole area in itself. We could probably run an entire webinar on that, but just give us a flavour of the sorts of issues. And I know you touched on it, but just go back to this problem of or challenge of communication with kids. Can you a little bit?
Well, funnily enough, we actually haven't had feedback from children yet. These are very of the moment materials, so they are being sent, or currently they're being sent to parents of children to review, to see their take on it. And I think we're investigating children reviewing as well. But it's certainly something that we've considered. Even just the fact that these children may have been sort of dealing with this condition for their whole life. So in fact, their level of understanding might be even higher than we think. So it's where do you pitch that? You don't want to patronize a child, especially if this is something, you know, you say you might feel poorly if you have this. They say, well, I know I feel poorly every day. But at the same time, you need to make sure that you're giving them all the information so that they don't go away from something thinking, or not realizing that they've not understood what's going to happen to them in a trial, something like that. So like I mentioned, that the age range is vast. So one of the things that we, with the client, decided to create 2 materials, one for a lower age range, the sort of 2 to 6 year olds, and then another for the older age range, because we realized that you just cannot possibly address, you know, the entire age range from 2 to 11 in one material to make it good for everyone. So so that's a solution that we've actually come across while working on this.
Okay, but there's an important point in there, I think. Let's just pick up on Andrew's question, because he sent it in several times actually, so he's very keen to get an answer to this. Andrew, what are your thoughts on the best ways to increase awareness amongst HCPs of rare disease? So, I mean, again, this is a huge topic, isn't it? But somebody just talk a little bit to that one in terms of, you know, what challenges are there? There are obvious challenges, sorry, but how do you address getting information to HCPs about rare disease that they may either never see or only once in a career sort of thing? Can anyone take that one up for Andrew? Rachel, looks like you're going to.
So I suppose there are a variety of ways, really, and I suppose it depends on the actual disease itself and how many experts there are in the field and how well known it already is. But we do a lot of Congress communications, which are always quite helpful, as well as like disseminating. We work quite a lot on publications as well, which obviously helps get the message out there to people that are interested and looking for it. So I suppose there's a whole manner of different routes you could take.
Just picking up on following that slightly, and picking up on Tom's point that just came in. He's saying, is it correct to say that case series type publications are more appropriate / prevalent in rare disease? There's like 2 different questions in there. You know, do you find yourself using case series type publications more often in rare disease type scenarios than generally? Is that a fair point? I guess you must do, mustn't you?
Yeah, we do. I think it is a fair point. I think, you know, given the lack of patients for clinical trials very often in the rarer diseases, you know, that there just isn't enough patients to get that clinical data. And so the only way, or one of the ways to educate other HCPs would be to publish case studies. Yeah. That's probably the one of the better ways of raising awareness amongst HCPs. Yeah.
Okay. And a couple of comments have come in about the sort of gene therapy side. That's just complicated. You know, it sounds complicated to me, sort of thing. It's just like, you know, how do you take what is probably perceived to be very complicated stuff and turn that into a language that's appropriate, not just for a patient as well, a lay person, but you know, there's a lot of non-specialists who are going to have to sort of get their head around that. That in itself is an interesting challenge from a communications point of view, I guess. I'm just very aware we're over time again. So to be honest, I think there are a couple of questions there. I think there's several I'd also like to pick up after this. No, I'm slightly over time, so I'm gonna draw a line. Sorry, I keep going over time with these things. What I think that was just really interesting and a good overview of some of the topics and issues involved. I know I can speak for all of you and say you're very happy to hear from people via LinkedIn. That's the easy way anyway. So please, you know, part of the point of these webinars, guys, is people make connections. So if anyone's watching this today or the recording or whatever, do reach out and make contact and follow up with your questions. But there's some good food for thought in there. So on that note, I'm going to say a huge thank you to the panelists. Thank you very much for giving up your time, and a huge thank you to the audience for joining in. And we are collecting these comments and questions, and it might be interesting for you guys at AMICULUM to have a look and consider some of these points that are coming in. We also have got some minutes left, so that if you are watching at the moment, don't rush away if you don't need to. We'll be here till the top of the hour. But on that note, please can I just say a big thank you to everybody. Wish you all please stay well in these very strange times, and we'll just give you a quick wave and stop the recording. So thank you very much. Take care. Bye.